Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Material Matters hosted by Grant Gibson. That's me. In each podcast, we're meeting a maker, designer or architect who is intrinsically linked to a particular material or technique, discovering how their crafts shape their lives and careers. For the next half hour or so, I'm delighted to be joined by one of the pioneers of the British studio glass movement, Peter Layton. Peter started his company, London Glassblowing, in 1976. And today, the studio on Bermondsey Street, where we're recording this, has 10 makers creating his designs, as well as a small but perfectly formed gallery and retail space. Thanks very much for doing this.
You're welcome.
Can we start off by talking about your background? Because your first kind of introduction to materials wasn't glass, was it?
I trained as a potter.
But even before that?
Well, even before that, yes. Okay, so to go right back to the beginning.
Let's go right back.
My parents were refugees. Well, I was a refugee, in fact. I was 2 years old. We escaped from the Nazis ostensibly. Legend has it that we were on the last train out of Prague in August 1939. So we arrived here. My parents didn't speak much English. I think they were butler and bottle washer and a housemaid for the first few months, but luckily, my grandfather had established himself in Yorkshire, in Bradford, in Yorkshire, as the city pathologist. He was quite an eminent doctor in Austria prior to that. And my family were all part of Viennese society. My dad happened to be working in Prague when I was born, and purely by chance, he was working for a glass company. He was on the admin side of things, but when I eventually became interested in glass, he was quite tickled.
So your first experience was with textiles, right?
Yes. Leaving school, I was offered a job ostensibly as a managerial trainee, and maybe with the idea that eventually I would marry the boss's daughter and take over the company. He was a very distant relative, and he'd spotted me, as it were, headhunted me, talked to my parents, and he himself didn't have a son who would take over the business, and perhaps he saw me as a potential. It was the rag trade. We were based in Batley near Dewsbury, a heavy woolen industry it was called. It was a very dirty, a filthy business in a sense. You know, we were dealing with reclaimed fibres, in inverted commas, but it was pretty dirty material and very dusty. I'm quite sure if I'd stayed, I'd been dead long ago.
So how did you move from that into clay? When did this interest in clay happen?
Yes, my work at this company was interrupted by by national service, and I did a couple of years in the RAF. And during that time, I became interested in art, more interested. I mean, I'd grown up. You can't say a childhood friend, but somebody I'd known quite well, even gone on holiday with as a young man, was David Hockney, and I was interested, very interested in the art scene around Bradford and so on. But and my grandfather used to take me to the Halle Orchestra, you know. So there was a degree of culture around, and. So when I came back after doing national service. Quite unusually, my boss had paid me some sort of retainer, not very much money, but something anyway, while I was doing my national service, and so I felt obligated to go back. But my interests had changed to some extent, and I'd been quite active in the Zionist youth movement, and.
While you're in the RAF?
While I was in the RAF, I'd been stationed down in Southampton, and it wasn't a million miles from London, so I could come up and participate in group activities. And London was a major centre for that kind of thing. And I was invited to take part in a year's course for youth leaders. And so I went to Israel for a year, and that was wonderful. It was a great year. And the person who taught handicrafts, he was quite an established artist, took me under his wing for some reason, and I became very excited about art. So much so that I used to go out and give English lessons to pay for me to do drawing classes at the Bezalel School of Art, the main school of art in Israel, which happened to be based in Jerusalem, where we were for a period. And when I came back, I decided alongside my youth activities, again, it was a commitment that I'd made, following this year's training. Alongside that, I went to art college. I went to Bradford College of Art, and that was a very enjoyable experience.
Why clay? What was it about clay that you enjoyed?
So initially, I did a general course, as it were, what would today be called. It was pre-foundation, but you did a bit of everything, and I gravitated from 2D, from painting and printmaking to 3D. Became more interested in 3D. I enjoyed the sculpture classes, and particularly ceramics, pottery. I was drawn towards clay, to working three-dimensionally. Perhaps it was something to do with the speed of the process. I tend to enjoy... having said that, now I'm jumping forward about 50 or 60 or 70 years. Now I tend to try to use the glass in quite painterly ways. But at that time, I was very drawn towards three-dimensional work.
I mean, you ended up going to the Central School of Art and Design, as it was known then, Central St Martin's, as it's known now, where you kind of rubbed up against the likes of Ian Old, Ruth Dickinson, Gordon Baldwin. What was that like?
Oh, that was fantastic. Yes, I went to Central to specialise in ceramics, clay, pottery. It was those were golden years in a way at the Central. So there were 2 or 3 main ceramics departments in the country at that time, and the Central was one of them. Our head of the department was a man called Gilbert Harding Green, and he'd been an acolyte of Dora Billington. So these are pioneers of the studio pottery movement. The Royal College was another important department, but that was more, how can I put it, that was more, it was more interested in the industry. It was training people for industry rather. And then there was Camberwell, and Camberwell and the Central vied with one another at that time.
And was your notion at that point to become a studio potter? Was that what you wanted to do?
Yes, it was. Yes, clay is a great medium. I love it still. I mean, the idea of getting your hands into clay, there's nothing better in many ways. Glass has some additional attributes, and the thing about glass is that it's so immediate by comparison. Clay, making pots, wonderful activity, but it can take forever. You make your thing, you dry it, you fire it, you bisque fire it, then you maybe glaze it or continue, and then you fire it again, and it can all take months. But some potters only have one firing a year, or 2 or 3, or once a month. But the way we work, it's almost like you're having a firing each day. And that is so exciting. I mean, the most exciting bit of the whole process is getting the piece out of the kiln or out of the annealing oven, and seeing what you've ended up with.
So it's speed that's important in other words. Because potters often talk about the
Yes.
kind of, it's this notion of having their fingers in the material, and obviously hot glass, you're definitely not doing that.
No, you're not actually touching it, but you're getting pretty close. Yes, it's like once removed because you're using tools or a paper pad between you and the hot glass. No, it is absolutely about getting your fingers in the clay. I had tried a whole lot of processes, earthenware, stoneware, porcelain, and I'd, as it were, graduated to raku, which is a technique where you take the hot pot out of a small kiln and you stick it into sawdust and smoke it. So I was working quicker and quicker with the clay, and certainly towards the end of working with clay, I was throwing with the wheel going faster than I could control in an effort to see what the clay itself would do, rather than me controlling the form to the nth degree. And that was a quality I discovered in the glass, that the glass contributes to what you're doing. It's not there are glass makers who want to control it to the nth degree. They have a form drawn out on paper and they measure it, and they may make sets of goblets, say, and everyone's got to be perfect and they've all got to match. If I were making a set of goblets, I would want them all to be different, so that people around the table argue about which is the nicest and which one they'd like to have, or which one they'd like to be using, or they pass them around so you get a feel for...
Can we talk about the transition then from one material to the other, from clay to glass? How and where did that happen?
Yes. Yes, I can talk about that. I was slightly on thinking about the tactile qualities of clay.
Well, all right, we can get into that.
And certainly in the early days, and even now, because I etch quite a lot of the glass, I'm not only interested in the visual qualities. I'm the tactile qualities, the textures are incredibly important to me, and I think that does come from having worked with clay. I suppose I was always more interested in matte glazes or rough textures with oxides rubbed in than I was in very flashy, shiny glazes. But to go back to your question about the transition,
yes.
I was teaching ceramics at the University of Iowa in the mid-'60s, and the head of department, as it were, had gone on sabbatical, and I was sharing responsibility for the department with someone else. But during that time, one of the students of Harvey Littleton, who's generally acknowledged as the father of contemporary glass or of studio glass, came to our campus and set up a summer school. I was only in Iowa for 12 months, but the last couple of months of that was a summer school. And I signed up as a student, having done I was still teaching ceramics, but I was getting towards the end of that period, and I signed up as a student. Well, sadly, I burnt myself badly, rolled hot glass over the back of my hand. It really was the very, very early days of studio glass. So glass as a medium has got a few thousand-year history. But it was an activity that went on behind closed doors. Secrets passed from family to family or from father to son. And people like me wouldn't have had access, or purely as one small element of a process in a factory, maybe. But as an artist, one wouldn't have had access to the technology. We wouldn't have known. So the studio glass movement has really been, in the early years particularly, about rediscovering or reinventing the techniques that glassmakers have used over centuries.
And were you immediately smitten? I mean, it sounds like you had quite a nasty accident to begin with. Did this not put you off?
I thought it had. Yes, I thought it was a bad burn, and I thought I thought, well, that's that, you know. I've done that, been there, done that. But you know, you get hooked, and I was hooked. So after I left Iowa, I went to California. I taught in California. In the meantime,
teaching clay. Still.
Teaching clay,
right?
Teaching ceramics. Sacramento State College, which became Sacramento University, and then later at the University of California at Davis. Really, really interesting teaching jobs, and California was the place to be in ceramics at that time. I was friendly. I'm not name dropping, but I was friendly with Peter Volkers and Robert Arneson. In fact, I replaced Bob Arneson at Davis when he went on sabbatical. And a host of other top ceramists. Some of them were even my students, although David Gilhooly, people that were doing fantastic work and showing in galleries that I couldn't even get into. Just happened that because I was there at Davis, they were my graduate students, you know. So I was rubbing shoulders with a lot of good people. And in fact, I did make some pretty good work at that time. So the great thing about working in the States then was that I had my teaching post, but I was given a studio, and even some funding to make my own work. A bit like, you know, if you're an academic, you're encouraged to publish. You know, do research and publish. Well, that was my research, to get on and do things. And anyway, there was such an extraordinary atmosphere at that time. You know, there were so many exciting artists working in clay. And, you know, I'd only just got the glass bug. I mean, that was sort of buried, really.
But you came back in '68 to the UK.
I came back in '68, and that was the Wilson era, and it was a really tough time. You know, it was such a shock to the system. As I said, I'd been fated almost in the States. I'd had important shows at the Art Institute of Chicago with Viola Frey, in San Francisco with Mel Ramos, who was quite a well-known pop artist of the time. David Hockney was around. I'd known him as when I was growing up. I met Eduardo Palozzi in California. There was a lot of toing and froing, and you know, Warhol was busy where he was, and I'd even been to New York and been to his place.
So when you came back to the UK, different scene, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Like coming down from... I don't take drugs, never have, but I imagine like coming down from a high. You know, it was just tough. And I did a lot of teaching, and it was all part-time in different places. And one of the places was Stoke-on-Trent. So I'd commute up there, stay overnight, do a couple of days, and come back to London. I was London-based. And during that time, I went on a trip to Scotland and discovered that a pottery that I'd done work experience in as a student in Mora, a place called Mora near Mallaig, overlooking the Isle of Skye, I discovered that was empty and going derelict. I never did stop it going derelict, but I ran a summer school there. I'd been to Haystack, and I knew what American summer schools were a little bit like. So I ran one. I think I can't remember whether I did 1 or 2 years, but it was so exhausting. I mean, people would come and stay, and we'd work 24 hours a day. I mean, they wanted, you know, blood out of a stone, really, which was fair enough. I mean, you know, they'd paid to come and they wanted to get the most out of it. But anyway, as part of that, I did a weekend, an introduction to glass. So I built a small glass studio at Mora alongside, in the pottery. I created a space to make glass. And that rekindled my excitement and my interest, and the response from the students was so fantastic that I then began to search for somewhere to make glass, and I suppose I dabbled around a bit at the Royal College. I became friendly with Sam Herman, who had brought the small furnace technology that constituted studio glass to England, first to Edinburgh and then to the Royal College. So as glass goes, I'm more or less self-taught. I've never had formal training, but it's been learning on the job, really.
So the glass is beginning to take over. What prompted you to start London Glassblowing?
Yes, I as part of that process of getting involved in things in London, I joined. Well, I became one of the people who was originally involved with the Glass House
In Covent Garden.
In Covent Garden, yes.
Right.
It was the concept was to provide a facility for. I mean, Sam came up with the idea. Sam Herman persuaded Graham Hughes at the British Craft Centre to set up a studio adjacent to it in, as you said, in Neal Street in Covent Garden. And it was beautifully set up. An interior designer created these wonderful backlit panels to display the glass, and I helped Sam build the original furnace, but I suppose I wasn't ever a full-time member, but I began to hanker for my own studio, and I just hunted around till I found one. Michael Murray was very active in the early mid-70s, creating multiple studios for young craftsmen to work. He himself was a silversmith, and that was about the time when the Crafts Council was starting to operate. Again, an exciting time to be around. So I'd been looking for quite a long time, and then one of Michael's projects was a thing called Rotherhithe Workshops, and it was a bunch of old warehouses on the river, and one of them was a towage works, a single-story towage works. And one of the things that had bothered me about the glass house in Covent Garden was that people lived above it, and I was a bit paranoid about, God forbid there'd be a fire or something, and it would all go up in smoke. So I found a single-story building with a tin roof, no one living above, that seemed ideal as a studio. It looked out over the Thames, had a little balcony where we used to go and cool off. And I started. And again, it was the blind leading the blind. I had a friend whom I'd met at National Natural Childbirth Trust. We'd laid on the ground and huffed and puffed together, while as part of the process. And I just said to him, would you like to come and work with me up at Mora and see if we can make some glass? And he did. He made the 600-mile journey, and we worked there for a few weeks together. And when I found the Rotherhithe studio, I asked him to come and help me, be my assistant, if you like, or help me get things going. And soon after that, other people wanted to join us. Norman Stewart Clark came from Nazing Glass, Siddy Langley, who is still, both of whom are still working glass. Siddy Langley is down in Devon. She had a few boutiques with vintage clothing, and she came and did one of my classes, and almost overnight gave up the boutiques and came to be our apprentice.
So this was 1976?
We're talking 1970. Well, 1976, I actually started the studio, and I had my first major show that year because there was a very important conference at the Royal College of Art called International Hot Glass, and people came from all over the world. And it was a brilliant event, and I was lucky enough to have an exhibition. I managed to organise to have an exhibition scheduled for that time at the Camden Art Institute, and people came to see it and were very complimentary. And so I was working, so that was late 1976, but I suppose, really during 77, 78 was when we began to take off.
What was the glass market like at that time?
Oh,
Peter?
non-existent. Absolutely not. Well, there was the glass house, and most of the craft galleries, the decent craft galleries that existed, were only really interested in ceramics, and possibly jewellery, I suppose. The kind of response you'd get as you were hawking your wares was, oh, you need special lighting. Like the backlighting at the glass house, you need special lighting for glass, to display glass. And we don't have it, and our customers don't have it, so no thanks.
And how has that changed now?
However,
has it changed?
However, my solution to that was that I looked for a type of glass that didn't need special lighting. And I came up with the idea that iridizing was the answer, which was producing work slightly in the vein of Tiffany. And that was its downfall. I mean, that was the problem with iridizing. It had that Art Nouveau connotation or connection. So it wasn't cutting edge in any way. But London Glassblowing made its name on the back of it because it was so beautiful visually, and B, so tactile. It was so the iridized work has such a beautiful surface, and it doesn't finger mark, the way normal glass does, shiny glass does. So it took me a long, long time to graduate to making so-called normal glass, shiny glass. I went through different periods of, as I said earlier, of etching, so iridizing, then etching everything, and then eventually I arrived at, thick, heavy, glossy glass.
But there's a market now. I mean, the market has changed. And how has it changed?
The market has changed, but I think it's been quite slow in the UK. Most collectors, and there aren't that many of them, there are a lot of collectors for antiques, for antique glass. A great many. And there are several societies whose members are avidly interested. So it's been quite a long uphill struggle to persuade the public to become interested in contemporary glass. Murano is another issue because, we have over the years had masses of customers walk in and, Murano, and our hearts sink, and more latterly, a couple of years.
Why would your heart sink?
Well, no, this is better. No, I'm kidding. It's just a superficial comparison. We're trying to do what we do, and of course it's the same material and there are connections, and anyway, techniques are pretty much the same in many ways, but we, as artists working here, and there are, say, 10 of us working, makers, we're all striving to find our separate directions. And of course, there's lots of overlap, and we influence one another and help one another and critique one another.
Can we talk a bit about
sure.
the setup of London Glassblowing and how that developed? Because it's quite unique, isn't it? You have 10 makers, directly below us as we speak now. How did that setup start, and what's the thinking behind it?
It was always my firm intention that whoever worked with me would make their own glass. They didn't simply work for me. They worked alongside me or with me, helped me with my work where it was required. And in the early days, I was making a lot of it myself, and people were assisting me. More latterly, I'm approaching 82, and we're working bigger and thicker and heavier. I have a lot of help. I don't necessarily handle the blowing iron myself, but it's very much my work, and it wouldn't happen without me. So the principle is that the guys help me with whoever's working. I say guys, but not necessarily men. They help me with my work, and I facilitate by providing the glass studio in many cases. I pay them as well, but they help me with my work in order to gain furnace time to do their own work. Or the other facilities we have, like cold working facilities.
And you've been on this site in Bermondsey Street for, nearly a decade now.
Yes, we're about to celebrate our 10th year here.
How important is it to be making in what is fundamentally the heart of London?
It's yes, many times people have said, why don't you move out? Because, it would be so much cheaper or less expensive to work outside London. But this is where the market, such as it is, this is where it is for the most part. We're established here. People know us. We've got pretty large clientele. Sadly, a lot of them are getting older like I am, or they're running out of space. But, we are working quite hard to attract a new audience. It's really important to be in town. For me, I think we're the only major studio left in London. There were several at one time, but they've gradually had to move out. Or we're the only one that really has a degree of public access anyway. Let's put it there. We have a gallery and the public are encouraged to come and watch the process.
And do you have a sense of the future, not only for London Glassblowing, but for the studio glass movement itself in this country?
I'd like to say the glass movement here was burgeoning, and I have said that in the past. And I do want to be positive about it. I think things are going in the right direction, but it is slow and it is tough. It is a struggle, and it has a lot to do with things going on out, beyond the studio, as it were. Various recessions, Brexit, call it what you will. Who knows what influences the public, when they think, we get untold numbers of people who tell us how wonderful the work is, their jaws drop when they walk in. It's like in Aladdin's cave. It's full of treasures. So we have become something of a destination, but we also attract Bermondsey Street has developed so much in those 10 years. It's a real foodie haunt. We've got such good restaurants, and White Cube is here, the biggest commercial gallery in Europe, Fashion and Textile Museum across the road. And we get a lot of people coming from the Fashion and Textile Museum, and they are our target audience, in fact.
So you're coming up to 82?
Yes.
And the plan is to continue making?
The plan is to continue making, yes. I don't ever relish retiring. I suppose I'd like to withdraw, but that isn't easy at this stage. Maybe, the problem is that staff come and go. That's not true on the making side so much. Most Lane Rowe, one of the best makers in the country, has been with me for over 20 years. Louis Thompson has been here well over 10 years. Bruce Marks is the same. I'm trying to think. Tim Rawlinson's been here 7 years. People stay. The working conditions are good. Maybe I'm a bit soft, and anyway, they stay. Sometimes Anthony Scala's another one. He first came when he was an 8-year-old boy, and was so entranced that eventually he joined us. We do have a very good team.
Peter Layton, I've taken up far too much of your time. Thank you so much for doing this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.